click here to click here to click here.
Journey to the center of the earth. Looking back to all that occurred to me since that eventful day, I'm scarcely able to believe in the reality of my adventures. They were truly so wonderful that even now I'm bewildered when I think of them. It all began at my uncle's house in the oldest part of Hamburg, one of the few houses that had been spared by the Great Fire of 1842. It was a little off the perpendicular and seemed inclined to fall into the canal. My uncle, Otto Lidenbrock, was 50 years old and a very learned man. He was a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, mineralogy, and many other ologies. I took a deep interest in all his doings and hoped someday to be almost as learned myself. That Sunday, May the 24th, 1863, he received me in his study. It was a perfect museum containing every natural curiosity that can well be imagined. Minerals, however, predominated. I found him poring over a yellow-leafed volume, which to me appeared to possess but little value. My uncle, however, was in raptures.
"Wonderful!"
he cried.
"Wonderful, wonderful! It is the Heimskringla of Snorre Tarlsson, the celebrated Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is a true and correct account of the Norwegian princes who once reigned in Iceland."
I was about to make a misplaced joke on the subject when a small scrap of parchment fell out of the leaves. Like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread, the professor seized it. It was about 5 inches by 3 inches and was scrawled over in the most extraordinary fashion.
"I declare,"
cried my uncle.
"it is runic and contains some wonderful secret which I must get at any price. I will substitute,"
he said,
"a letter of our alphabet for that of the runic. We will see what that will produce."
The result appeared very strange to me. My uncle examined the words with a rapt and deep attention.
"I should like to know what it means,"
he said after a long pause.
"The manuscript volume and the smaller document are written in different hands,"
he said.
"The cryptograph is of much later date than the book. To me, it appears probable that this sentence was written by some owner of the book."
Professor Lidenbrock took off his spectacles. Taking a powerful magnifying glass, he examined the book carefully. On the flyleaf was what appeared to be a blot of ink, but on examination he made out more runic characters.
"Arne Saknussemm,"
he translated in a joyous and triumphant tone.
"That is not only an Icelandic name, but that of a learned professor of the 16th century, a celebrated alchemist. This man, Saknussemm,"
he went on,
"was a very learned man. He probably, like most learned men of his time, wrote in Latin, and barbarous Latin too. Probably we shall find that the phrase is arranged to some mathematical plan. No doubt a certain sentence has been written out, then jumbled up. But how?"
The professor then read out to me a list of letters, taking a letter at a time from each column, which I then wrote down.
"But it still makes no sense,"
he cried. I took up the execrable puzzle and tried every imaginable way of grouping the letters. It was enough to drive one mad. My eyes strained with looking at the parchment. I was stifling. I wanted air. I fanned myself with the document, seeing first the back and then the front. Imagine my surprise when suddenly I clearly made out Latin words. I had discovered the secret. All you had to do to understand the document was to read it backwards. "Uncle," I cried, "mark it from right to left."
"Backwards?"
he shouted in wild amazement.
"Oh, most cunning Saknussemm."
He snatched the document and read it out as I had done, starting from the end. It was in dog Latin, which, when translated, became,
"Descend into the crater of Jökull of Sneffels. which the shade of Scartaris caresses before the calends of July, audacious traveller, and you will reach the centre of the earth. I did, Anis Acnusum.
My uncle leapt 3 feet from the ground with joy. He punched the air.
What's o'clock?
He said. About 3.
We can start at once. Get my portmanteau and your own ready.
Oh, what for?
A journey to the centre of the earth.
While preparations for our journey began, my uncle explained what the mysterious message might mean.
The whole of Iceland is composed of volcanoes,
He told me.
They all bear the name of Jökull, which is Icelandic for glacier, because the volcanic eruptions come from ice-bound caverns.
But what, I asked, is meant by Sneffels? Said the professor.
It's a mountain about 5,000 feet in height. One of the most remarkable in the whole island, and now certainly doomed to be the most celebrated in the world. For through its extinct crater we shall reach the centre of the earth.
What about the burning lava? I said.
There are about 300 volcanoes on the whole surface of the globe, but most are extinct. Sneffels is one of them.
And Scartaris and the calends of July? The professor reflected deeply. Then he said,
Sneffels has many craters. Saknussemm has pointed to the exact one which is the highway to the interior of the earth. He tells us that about the end of the month of June, the shadow of Mount Scartaris falls upon the one crater. There can be no doubt about the matter.
Saknussemm is right, I said. He found the entrance to the bowels of the earth. Let's go and see, though how we can do that in the dark is a mystery.
Fear nothing,
replied my uncle.
We shall overcome all such difficulties.
Next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the post-chaise was at the door for the start of our adventurous journey. From Hamburg, the railway took us to Kiel, where we transferred to a steamship. Our next stop was the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, where we were to join the good ship Valkyrie for the voyage to Iceland. The schooner entered the channel, and within the hour, the land seemed to sink into the waves. Towards evening, we crossed the Skagerrak, cut across the tip of Norway, and entered the North Sea. 2 days later, we sighted the coast of Scotland, passed between Orkney and Shetland, and reached the Faroe Islands. On the 11th day, we reached Iceland and steered towards Reykjavik. My uncle pointed to a high mountain.
Behold,
he said,
Mount Sneffels.
We were met by Mr. Fridriksson, Professor of Natural Science in the College of Reykjavik, who invited us to his house.
Well, Mr. Fridriksson,
my uncle said at dinner that night,
I was desirous of ascertaining if, among your oldest books, you had any of Arne's Saknussemm.
Saknussemm! cried our host. You speak of that great scholar of the 16th century, of that great naturalist, that great alchemist, that great traveller.
Exactly so.
One of the most distinguished men of Icelandic literature and science.
As you say, sir.
One of the most illustrious of men.
True, but what of his works?
His works? We have none of them. Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 all his works were publicly burnt at Copenhagen by the hand of the common hangman.
Good, capital,
said my uncle, to the astonishment of the Icelander. He went on,
I now understand why Arne Saknussemm, put out of court and forced to hide his magnificent discoveries, was compelled to conceal beneath the veil of an incomprehensible cryptograph the secret.
What secret? asked Mr. Fridriksson.
A secret which...
stammered my uncle. Have you discovered some wonderful manuscript? cried Mr. Fridriksson.
No, I was carried away by my enthusiasm, a mere supposition.
Fortunately, Mr. Fridriksson decided to change the subject. I hope you will not leave our island without examining its mineral riches, he said. You have no idea how many unknown mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are which remain to be studied. Without moving from where we sit, I can show you one. It is called Sneffels, one of the most curious volcanoes in existence. Its crater is rarely visited.
Extinct?
asked my uncle. Extinct for the last 600 years.
Excellent,
said my uncle, who was crossing and uncrossing his legs to prevent himself jumping for joy.
I have decided to begin my studies with an examination of the geological mysteries of this Mount Sneffels. I will endeavour to climb its summit and, if possible, descend into its crater.
Mr. Friedrichsen said he regretted not being able to accompany us, but would arrange a reliable guide. The next day he introduced us to a man of tall stature and perfect Herculean build, who was called Hans Bjelke. He was obviously possessed of great strength. His eyes started rather prominently from a very large head. He appeared to be very quick and intelligent. His long hair, which even in England would have been accounted exceedingly red, fell over his athletic shoulders. This native of Iceland was supple in appearance, though he scarcely moved his arms while listening to my uncle's wild gesticulations. He told us the distance to Sneffels was about 22 miles, a journey which we supposed would take about 2 days. His engagement with my uncle was by no means to cease with the arrival at Sneffels. Although we didn't tell him then, he was to accompany us all the way to the interior of the earth. The instruments we were to take with us included 1. A centigrade thermometer by Eigel, graduated up to 150 degrees. If the temperature ever went that high, we would certainly be cooked. 2. A manometer, which was worked by compressed air. This would show us the increase in atmospheric pressure as we went further underground. 3. A first-class chronometer made by Boissanos of Geneva and set to the Hamburg meridian. 4. A night glass. 5. 2 compasses to measure both positive and negative inclination. 6. 2 Ruhmkorff lamps, which were very easy to carry and would provide us with electric light when we were in complete darkness. We also packed rifles, revolvers, gunpowder, ice picks, pickaxes, an axe, a hammer, lengths of rope, and a silken ladder 300 feet long. For provisions, we took a large quantity of dried meat and biscuits, as well as gin and tobacco. Finally, we ensured we had plenty of medical supplies. We left Reykjavik with Hans walking at a steady, rapid and unvarying step. He was followed by 2 horses carrying our luggage. My uncle and I came behind, mounted on small but vigorous horses. The journey lasted many days, during which my uncle partly confided in Hans and told him it was his intention to explore the volcano to its limits. Hans listened calmly, then nodded his head. To bury himself in the bowels of the earth or to travel to its summits was all the same to him. But one thought began to trouble me. We had seen no evidence to prove that Sneffels was really extinct. What proof was there that an eruption was not shortly to take place? Because the monster has slept soundly since 1229, does it follow that he is never to wake? In the end, I could stand it no longer. I decided to put the case to my uncle. If he does awake, what is to become of us? I asked.
It is now 600 years since Sneffels has spoken,
he said.
But volcanic eruptions are always preceded by perfectly well-known phenomena. I have questioned many of the local inhabitants. I have studied the soil. I can assure you, Axel, there will be no eruption.
He took me into the open country. It was littered with enormous rocks of basalt, granite, lava, and other volcanic substances. Here and there, giant spouts of steam rose into the air from hot springs underground.
You see all this steam?
Asked my uncle.
As long as you see them like this, you have nothing to fear from the volcano.
But how can that be? I asked.
Remember this,
continued the professor.
At the approach of an eruption, these spouts redouble their activity. But they disappear completely when the phenomenon actually begins. You may be quite sure that there is no fear of any immediate eruption.
But...
Enough, my boy! When science has spoken, one must hear and obey.
This important matter settled and back with the rest of the party, Hans gave the signal for the start of our climb up the 5,000 feet high volcano of Sneffels. We walked in single file, preceded by Hans, up narrow paths where 2 persons could not possibly walk abreast. As we advanced, the route became more and more difficult and dangerous. Rocks broke and gave way under our feet, rushing to the plains below like a series of small avalanches. Then, as I looked down, I saw a prodigious volume of pulverized pumice stone, sand and dust. It was rising to the heavens like a mighty waterspout, the wind driving it to the mountainside where we perched. "Hastig, hastig!" cried our guide. I certainly knew nothing of Danish, but I well understood his meaning. We quickly hastened out of the area. Then we watched as the gigantic whirlwind of sand passed the very spot we had been. But for the precaution and knowledge of our guide, our dislocated bodies, our crushed and broken limbs would have been cast to the wind like dust from some unknown meteor. We continued our painful ascent for another 5 hours. Finally, we stood on the summit and prepared to descend into the crater that was to shelter us for the night. The crater of Mount Sneffels formed an inverted cone, the mouth 1/2 mile across and thousands of feet deep. Imagine how it must have been when full of flame and thunder. It reminded me of a giant loaded cannon. It terrified me. To descend into the interior of a cannon, I thought to myself, when it may be loaded and could go off at the least shock, is the act of a madman. I felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. At the bottom were 3 separate shafts through which, when Sneffels was in action, burning lava and poisonous fumes would pour. The professor went to inspect them, running from one to the other. Suddenly, he shouted,
"Axel, come here! Make haste! Look at this."
On the side of a giant boulder were the same runic characters, now eaten away by time.
"Arne Saknussemm,"
cried my uncle.
"can you now have any doubt?"
Hans, my uncle, and I passed our first night at the bottom of the crater. Next day, the sky was dark and grey. My uncle was devoured with rage. The reason was simple. Of the 3 openings yawning beneath us, only one had been followed by the adventurous Saknussemm. According to the ancient cryptogram, it would only be known when the shadow of Scartaris fell on it. But with no sun, there was no shadow, and no chance of finding the right route. For days there had been no change in the weather. My uncle was almost frantic. Then, when we had almost given up hope, the sun's rays began to move across the bottom of the crater. To my uncle's insane delight, the shadow of Scartaris was marked and clear as it slowly moved over the rocks. And at 12 o'clock exactly, when the sun had attained its highest altitude, the shadow fell right upon the central pit.
"We have found it!"
Gasped the professor.
"Forward, my friends, into the interior of the earth."
Our real journey now commenced. The hole itself measured about 100 feet across. I leaned over a rock which stood on the edge and looked down. My hair stood on end, my limbs trembled. I was looking down a wild and savage staircase without a banister.
"Let us see about the baggage,"
said my uncle.
"The fragile objects must be divided into 3 separate parcels, and each of us must carry one on his back. Hans will carry the tools and some of the provisions. Axel will take more of the provisions and the firearms. I will take the rest and the more delicate instruments."
My uncle was certainly not fond of half measures. He had Hans tie the whole of the non-fragile articles into one bundle. This packet was firmly and solidly fastened with strong rope. Then it was simply pitched over the edge of the gulf.
"Now then,"
he cried,
"it's our turn."
The descent then began in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. We lowered ourselves on a rope which seemed hardly able to bear the weight of 3 people. The silence was only disturbed by the sound of pieces of rock falling beneath us as we went down. After 3 hours, we seemed to be as far as ever from the bottom of the well. Still we continued to descend, and all the time it was getting darker. We had started at 1 o'clock. By about 11 o'clock at night, I estimated we were some 5,000 feet down. Then I heard the voice of Hans from below.
"Halt! We have reached the end of the journey,"
said the worthy professor in a satisfied air. What, the interior of the Earth? Said I, slipping down to their sides.
"No, you stupid fellow,"
he said.
"but we have reached the bottom of the chimney."
Can we make no further progress? I asked, rather hoping that our adventure might be at an end.
"Oh, yes,"
he said.
"I can dimly see a sort of tunnel which turns to the right. Let us eat and sleep now, and continue on the morrow."
By the dim light, we opened our food bags. Then we lay down and tried to sleep on our beds of stone. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. Rays of daylight glinted from the lava walls. We were able to see objects around us with ease.
"We have only just reached the ground level of the island,"
said the professor.
"This long vertical tube, which starts at the bottom of the crater of Sneffels, stops here at sea level."
We consulted the barometer to confirm this, but my uncle said he would prefer to use the manometer from this point. With the weight of air becoming greater than its pressure at sea level, our barometer would now become useless. "But," I asked my uncle, "how will we be able to stand the increasing pressure?"
"We shall descend very slowly, and so our lungs will gradually get used to breathing condensed air,"
he said.
"It is well known that aeronauts have gone so high as to be nearly without air at all. As we descend, we may perhaps have too much. We shall see."
As my uncle made this remark, he turned on the ROMHACK lamp. Hans was carrying the second lamp, which he also switched on. The effect was magical. This most ingenious application of electricity to practical purposes was to enable us to move along by the light of an artificial day. Lava flowing through this tunnel in 1229 had lined it with crystals of opaque quartz. Limpid clusters of natural glass hung from the roof and seemed to take fire as we passed beneath them. Magnificent! I couldn't help shouting at the wonder of it all. After 10 hours walking, we sat down to eat. We ate ravenously. One thing, however, caused us great uneasiness. Our water reserve was already half exhausted. We had only 5 days' supply left, but my uncle was confident we would find subterranean resources. I was also surprised that the heat was not greater than it was.
"What does the thermometer say?"
asked the professor. "Scarcely 15 degrees, I said. "It's an increase of only 9 degrees since we left."
"What do you make of that?"
he asked. "Well," I explained as best I could, "we know from observations that temperature increases for every 100 feet you go into the interior of the Earth, but that figure can depend on the locality. For instance, near an
Click here to start from the beginning.
"The inland sea."
In my wildest imagination, I would never have conjured up such.
Into the quarter of...
Our real journey now commenced. The descent then began in the... At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. other revelations waiting for us in this great cavern. Ahead,
Click here to start.
at 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. The descent then began in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. The descent then began in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. We lowered ourselves on a rope which seemed high. The descent then began in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. We lowered ourselves on a rope which seemed hardly able to bear the weight of 3 people. The silence was only disturbed by the sound of pieces of rock falling beneath us as we went down. After 3 hours, we seemed to be as far as ever from the bottom of the well. Still we continued to descend, and all the time it was getting darker. We had started at 1 o'clock. By about 11 o'clock at night, I estimated we were some 5,000 feet down. Then I heard the voice of Hans from below.
Halt! We have reached the end of the journey,
Said the worthy professor in a satisfied air. What, the interior of the earth? Said I, slipping down to their sides.
No, you stupid fellow.
He said.
But we have reached the bottom of the chimney.
Can we make no further progress? I asked, rather hoping that our adventure might be at an end.
Oh, yes.
He said. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us.
Lost battle.
Click here to start from the beginning.
Journey to the center of the earth. Looking back to all that occurred to me since that eventful day, I'm scarcely able to believe in the reality of my adventures. They were truly so wonderful that even now I'm bewildered when I think of them. It all began one next day at 5 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Friedrich, the inst This important matter settled and back with the rest of the party, Hans gave the signal for the start of our climb up the 5,000 feet high volcano of Sneffels. We walked in single file, preceded by Hans, up narrow paths where two persons could not possibly walk abreast. As we advanced, the route became more and more difficult and dangerous. Rocks broke and gave way under our feet, rushing to the plains below like a series of small avalanches. Then, as I looked down, I saw a prodigious volume of pulverized pumice stone, sand and dust. It was rising to the heavens like a mighty waterspout, the wind driving it to the mountainside where we perched. "Hastig, hastig!" cried our guide. I certainly knew nothing of Danish, but I well understood his meaning. We quickly hastened out of the area. Then we watched as the gigantic whirlwind of sand passed the very spot we had been. But for the precaution and knowledge of our guide, our dislocated bodies, our crushed and broken limbs would have been cast to the wind like dust from some unknown meteor. We continued our painful ascent for another 5 hours. Finally, we stood on the summit and prepared to descend into the crater that was to shelter us for the night. The crater of Mount Sneffels. Next day, the sky was dark and grey. My uncle was devoured with rage. Our real journey now commenced. The hole itself measured about 100 feet across. The descent then began in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. We lowered ourselves on a rope which seemed hardly able to bear the weight of 3 people. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a faint kind of dawn awoke us. Rays of daylight glinted from the lava. The next day we resumed our journey. There was a sudden change in the walls on either side. By now, we were all beginning to feel the first pangs of thirst. We needed to replenish our stock of water. We returned to the crossroads, and this time we resumed by means of the western gallery. Hans was in front as usual. But now our supply of water had given out. I would have bartered a diamond mine for a glass of pure spring water. Soon I was in terrible pain. I could go no further and fell to the ground. Desperately I cried, "Help! I'm dying!" But my companions were motionless. Were they asleep or dead? Would any of us ever again see the light of day? Then I saw the Icelander get up and creep away from us, lamp in hand. Why was he abandoning us? I tried to cry out, but my voice could find no way through my parched lips. After a long, weary wait, I heard the sound of footsteps. Hans was returning. He went straight to my uncle. "Warten," said Hans. I did not understand a single word of Danish, yet the meaning was clear. "Oh,